She wasn't looking for anything, just checking the flower delivery receipt. One bouquet said "Happy Anniversary, Diane." The other? "I miss your skin." That's when everything fell silent. Diane from Sacramento thought she understood people after all, she was a therapist. But even she missed the signs when the betrayal was this calculated. And this close to home. Diane from Sacramento, he sent flowers to 2 women that day. Series, 10 True Affair Stories from California. The morning sun filtered softly through the gauzy white curtains in Diane's kitchen. The ocean breeze, crisp and familiar, carried in through the open window, brushing against the edges of her planner as she sipped coffee and opened her laptop. It was her wedding anniversary, 10 years. She wasn't expecting much. Robert had always been simple, predictable. But he never forgot flowers. She remembered seeing a delivery van pull up outside earlier and smiled faintly. Reliable. She opened the shared family email account to check a utility receipt when she noticed the subject line, "Your Bloom Vista order confirmation." She clicked without much thought. Order number 13,847, delivered to Diane Landers. Message, "Happy 10th, Diane." Address, 1135 Coastal Way, Santa Barbara. She smiled. Classic. A little dry, maybe. But Robert had never been poetic. Just as she was about to close the tab, another line caught her eye. Order number 13,848. Same date. Same sender. Different recipient. Her heart didn't jump. It didn't race. It just paused. Like someone had pressed the mute button on her bloodstream. She clicked. Order number 13,848, delivered to Emily R. Message, "I miss your skin." Address, 610 Montecito Hill Apartment 4, Santa Barbara. There was no reaction in her body, at least, not the kind people expect. No gasp, no shaking hands. Diane simply stared. Blinked once. Then twice. And read the message again. "I miss your skin." It was not just the message, it was the familiarity of the tone. The intimacy of it. The absence of punctuation made it worse somehow. It felt lived in. Habitual. Like it wasn't the first time he'd written those words. She closed the laptop lid slowly, like sealing a box she had no intention of opening yet. Her cup of coffee was still warm. She took another sip. Set it down. Folded her hands on the table and stared at the sunlight trembling on the surface of the ceramic tile. 10 years. Diane was not new to unraveling narratives. Her entire profession was built around it, helping others untangle truths too tightly woven into the fabric of their lives. But this was different. This wasn't a client. This wasn't theoretical. This was her. She stood, walked to the sink, and washed her coffee cup. The motion soothed her hands. She dried them gently. Then returned to the table and opened the laptop again. She looked at the details. 2 orders. Minutes apart. Both placed with the same credit card. Same Bloom Vista account. The delivery to her had arrived at 9:40 a.m. The other was scheduled for 11 o'clock. She highlighted the second address. Copied it. Opened a new tab and pasted it into the map search bar. A quiet apartment complex tucked near the hills, just 15 minutes away. She recognized the street. She'd driven past it dozens of times on the way to her office. Diane stared at the screen, letting the details line up on their own. The date. The name. The message. The choice of flowers. Red tulips. He never bought her tulips. She had once told him in passing that she didn't like them. Something about their fragility, the way they wilted too quickly. But the woman at 610 Montecito Hill got tulips. Diane opened a clean notepad. Wrote a single line at the top. This is not shock. This is structure. Her pen moved beneath it, bulleting the facts. No assumptions. No adjectives. Just data. Order times. Card used. Message content. Flower type. Address proximity. She wrote it all like she would for a patient file. Methodical. Contained. Because if she gave this event a shape, if she made it narrative, it wouldn't own her. She would own it. She stared at her own handwriting, wondering when she had last written something for herself. Across the room, the refrigerator hummed. The distant sound of waves rolled in from the coastline, breaking lightly against the edges of her concentration. She turned back to the screen. Looked again at the name. Emily R. There was something in that name. Familiar. She leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. The breeze from the window no longer felt refreshing. It felt sharp. Invasive. And still, Diane didn't cry. She sat for a long time, 10 minutes, maybe more, before closing the laptop for the second time. Her movements were slow, considered. Like she was wrapping a fragile object before putting it away. She stood, walked to the living room, and sat by the window. Outside, the world moved like it didn't know anything had changed. But inside her, something had. Not rage. Not panic. Just certainty. Diane had spent years helping people understand their stories. Now, she had one of her own. And she intended to understand every chapter of it. The address lingered in her mind like a half-remembered dream. Diane couldn't ignore it. She typed it again into her browser's map bar, zooming in this time, tracing the surrounding blocks. 610 Montecito Hill. A modest complex. Stucco walls, small balconies, a few potted plants by the staircase. Ordinary. But something about it clawed at her memory. She opened her encrypted client archive. The name Emily R. drifted forward in her mind like a ghost she hadn't spoken to in years. She typed it into her internal database. There were no recent files. But in the archive from nearly 3 years ago, there it was. Emily Rhodes. 27 intake form dated May 8th. Diane clicked. Notes appeared. Session summaries. Fragments of words and emotion. She began to read. Emily, soft-spoken. Restless hands. History of dating unavailable men. Referred by a colleague after showing signs of depression and low self-esteem tied to romantic patterns. In the second session, Diane had written, client disclosed ongoing relationship with older man. Believes he is married, though claims he is separated. Feels ashamed but can't walk away. Diane stared at the phrase. Her stomach turned not with surprise, but with a cold recognition. Her fingers moved to the following note. Emily described the man. Vague at first. Tech executive. Works remotely. Travel schedule inconsistent. Once brought her red tulips after a weekend apart. Tulips. She remembered that session. She remembered sitting across from Emily, nodding carefully as the young woman's voice trembled through the outline of an affair. At the time, Diane thought it was textbook. A predictable pattern of emotional dependency. But now it felt like a map, one that had been drawn in invisible ink and was only now becoming visible. She kept reading. Session 4, client mentioned man's calming voice and habit of touching her wrist when emphasizing a point. Mentioned he often said, "Let's keep this just between us, our little quiet corner of the world." Diane's vision narrowed. Her husband said that. She had heard it from his lips dozens of times at parties, after small arguments, whenever they shared a secret glance in public. It was his phrase. His signature. The air thickened. Diane stood, opened a window. The breeze hit her face, but it did nothing to ease the flush rising in her chest. Her hands were cold. How had she not seen it? Or had she, and just not wanted to? She sat down again and looked at Emily's file. The final session note, dated 6 months after their first meeting. Client discontinued therapy citing personal progress. Expressed gratitude but declined follow-up. Mentioned she had made peace with certain unresolved relationships. Diane had taken it at face value then. Another young woman moving on, perhaps returning to chaos but learning how to swim through it. Now, it sounded like resignation. Or worse, acceptance. She closed the file slowly, her hand lingering on the lid of the laptop. Her thoughts moved like ink spreading in water, expanding, impossible to gather back. She wasn't sure what hurt more, that her husband had done this, or that he had done it with someone who once sat across from her, asking for help. She felt foolish. But more than that, she felt implicated. Because if she couldn't see this in her own home, what authority did she have guiding others through their confusion? She had given Emily advice. Told her to value her boundaries. To reclaim her narrative. And now, she was sitting here, in her own kitchen, with the narrative quietly detonating under her feet. She stood and went to her bookshelf, pulling down an old leather journal, one she hadn't touched since grad school. She flipped past blank pages and scribbled theories until she found a clean one. She wrote. Observed breach of ethical boundaries, not mine, but overlapping. Dual betrayal, clinical and personal. She paused, then added. I am not in shock. I am in alignment. Clarity can resemble numbness. The page filled with phrases, short, surgical reflections that helped her breathe. She had always processed this way. Words before tears. Patterns before pain. Outside, the fog was rolling in over Santa Barbara. The coastline blurred. The world muted itself. She returned to the laptop, not to reopen the client file, but to pull up her calendar. There, on Thursday afternoon, an open slot. She created an event. Subject line, reassessment consultation. She addressed it to Emily's old email. Professional tone. Gentle invitation. No pressure. If she responded, fine. If not, also fine. The data was already speaking. And Diane had begun to listen not as a therapist, not as a wife, but as a woman who now knew where the thread began to unravel. And she wasn't going to stop until she reached the end of it. The office smelled of eucalyptus and clean paper. The chairs had been rearranged, two facing each other, angled slightly inward. Diane placed a small table between them, not for function, but symmetry. On it sat 3 folders, identical in appearance but each carrying a different weight. She had prepared the room like a stage, every detail designed to contain what was about to unfold. The soft lighting, the window cracked just enough to let in the breeze from the ocean, the framed certificate that hung behind her seat. Everything calm. Controlled. At 3:02 p.m., Emily arrived. She looked thinner than Diane remembered. Her hair darker. Her face drawn but polite. Nervous eyes flicked around the room before settling on Diane. "Thank you for reaching out," Emily said, folding her hands. Diane nodded. "Have a seat." Emily sat on the left chair. At 3:06, Robert walked in. He stopped in the doorway. Confusion flared across his face, then dimmed behind a practiced smile. "You wanted to meet? Is everything okay?" "Come in," Diane said. He stepped inside, saw Emily, and froze. She watched his pupils contract, his mouth open slightly, then close. He hesitated before taking the right chair. Neither of them spoke. Diane didn't introduce anyone. She didn't explain. She simply walked to the table, picked up the first folder, and handed it to Emily. Inside, a copy of the flower receipt, a time-stamped photo of the delivery at her apartment, and a typed paragraph, the exact quote from Emily's old file about the man who touched her wrist and whispered secrets. Emily read in silence. Her hands trembled slightly. Diane handed the second folder to Robert. Inside, the receipt for Diane's own flowers. A second photo. And a printout of the Bloom Vista order history, all linked to his name. He looked up slowly, jaw clenched. "This is Dash." She raised a hand, not to silence him, but to indicate there would be no dialogue. Diane returned to her seat, picked up the third folder, and opened it only enough to rest her hand inside. She looked at them. No one spoke. The seconds ticked by. Outside, a car passed. A bird called once. The breeze shifted the edge of a curtain. Emily finally broke the stillness. "You knew?" she asked Robert. He didn't answer. "You knew she was my therapist?" His lips parted, but again, nothing came. Emily turned to Diane. Her voice cracked. "You brought me here to punish me." "No," Diane said quietly. "I brought you here to let you both sit with what you built. Together." Robert stared at his hands. "It wasn't meant to be serious." "But it was," Diane replied. Her voice didn't rise. "You made it serious the moment you repeated our private language to someone else." She turned to Emily. And you knew. Not fully. But somewhere inside, you recognized the patterns. The familiarity. You came to me for a reason. Emily looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Robert shifted. Diane, I dash. No. There's no explanation. Only observation. And now you've both had the chance to observe. She stood. The session was over. She didn't offer hugs. She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't ask them to leave. She simply stepped outside the door and closed it behind her. In the hallway, she exhaled. Not with relief, but with resolve. The truth, spoken aloud or not, had a weight. She had placed that weight between them and let silence do the rest. No monologue. No accusation. Just two chairs. And everything they could no longer pretend not to see. The apartment was smaller than the house she had shared with Robert, but it faced the ocean and had windows that welcomed light in all the right places. From her writing desk, Diane could see the horizon blur into the sky. No boundary, just color shifting softly from blue to gray and back again. It was quiet, except for the distant hush of waves and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath her chair. She hadn't taken much when she left. Just essentials. A few books. Her journals. A kettle. The worn brown chair she'd written in since grad school. The rest she left behind, objects that once meant something but now felt like evidence from a former life. It wasn't an escape. It was a relocation of self. Her days became simpler. Mornings with tea and sunlight. Walks along the bluffs of Santa Barbara. Afternoons spent typing, deleting, typing again. She didn't write about what happened to her, not directly. Instead, she wrote about reflections. About the way people mirrored back what they feared. About emotional echo chambers. About betrayal not as a rupture, but as a cycle, a pattern that reveals as much about the betrayer as it does about the one betrayed. The essay began with the working title, Reflected Damage, Repetition and Emotional Imitation in Therapeutic Transference. She poured herself into it, not to purge, but to name. Language gave her clarity. Theory gave her peace. Every paragraph she shaped was a reclaiming of narrative, not the one Robert had written through lies, but the one she chose to reconstruct through understanding. She included a section on ethical leakage, how emotional intimacy, when left unexamined, can blur boundaries, distort identities, and invite repetition of harm. She wrote with precision, but not detachment. There was compassion in her voice, even for those who hurt her. That, she realized, was how she knew she had moved on. By the third week, the piece was complete. She sent it to a peer-reviewed journal in the field of trauma psychology and emotional ethics. 2 weeks later, she received a reply, accepted. The editors called it quietly devastating, elegantly argued. Colleagues began to email. Former students reached out. The essay was cited, shared, reposted. Not because it exposed a scandal, but because it named something people had felt but didn't yet know how to describe. One message stood out. A woman from Colorado wrote, "Your words described what happened to me in 2011. I thought I was alone. Thank you for showing me I wasn't crazy." Diane replied with sincerity and grace, but she didn't linger in correspondence. She wasn't building a following. She was building a foundation for herself. She didn't speak to Robert again, not because she hated him, but because their chapter had ended. And she had no interest in reading it aloud anymore. Emily didn't reach out either. Diane suspected she'd left town. Perhaps to start over. Perhaps to repeat. That wasn't Diane's responsibility. What mattered was that the version of herself who sat in silence between two chairs, that woman had risen. And she had walked out of the room with her spine intact and her voice sharpened. She didn't call herself a survivor. She didn't need labels. She was simply aware. Awake. And in the evenings, when the fog crept in and the waves thickened into darkness, Diane would light a candle, open a new page, and write. Not about betrayal. Not anymore. But about perception. About self-respect. About clarity in quiet places. She wrote because it reminded her that she wasn't broken. Only rewritten. Sometimes, clarity comes in silence. But other times, the truth doesn't wait for you to find it. It crashes into your life, in the middle of a birthday party. When the wrong phone starts ringing. In our next story, a woman from Fresno discovers a secret so careless it couldn't hide. Even when everyone else was watching. Stay with us for the next chapter in 10 True Affair Stories from California. Because some betrayals don't whisper. They explode.